It's good to be here with you this morning. If you're a visitor, if this is your first time here at Roanoke First, we're really glad. Dennis, you can roll that video. We're really glad that you have come here to be with us, and we'd love to invite you to come back again, all right? So I know we're just starting here with the message, but we're really, really glad that you're here. And here at our church, we don't want this just to be a social club or a place where we see the same people every week. We love having new people come, all right? The same thing is true if you've been coming here for forever, bring someone with you, all right? It's good to have company here and to help spread the word of God all throughout our city, our neighborhoods, and wherever it may be that you live. You may not live here in Roanoke. You may live out in the country, all right? But we want to make sure that everybody gets to hear the word of God. You know, I started us last week in a series called Miracles. You can see it on the screen here. Our series is called Miracles, and we're looking through the book of John. It's the fourth of what we would call the Gospels. What's interesting is the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are known as the Synoptic Gospels. And John is left out of that. What does that actually mean? Why do we say that? Well, here's the reason why. The book of John was written after the first three. Okay? Now, a lot of the same stories are in all four Gospels, but the book of John was written after the first three, and John, who wrote it, he happened to take a little bit of a different look at things. Now, it's not that he changed the stories at all, but it'd be as if I was writing down a first-hand account of what was happening in like a meeting. Anybody ever been a recording secretary in a meeting before? You're writing down what everybody's talking about in the meeting, right? Maybe you've never done that. If you're writing down notes right now, my wife takes really great notes as I'm preaching. I told somebody this week that if you ever want my sermon notes, like maybe you miss a week and you want my sermon notes, just photocopy her notebook because they're better than what I have up here, I promise. It's like the first three Gospels were being written down sort of as it was happening, or that's what they would look like, a very first-hand account. And John takes those stories, or the story of what happened, and makes it a little bit easier for us to understand, applies it more in layman's terms, if you will. And so what that means is that the miracles that Jesus performed, he uses a different term. Instead of saying the word miracle, he says signs. And we've talked about this last week, that a sign from God is not just a miracle, may be something like, I really want you to do this, God, and you ask him to do it, and he does it, and you're so thankful, right? But a sign is a miracle that God might perform that is indicative of something bigger and greater about God. It reveals something about him and who he is. So as we're working through John, we need to understand that the author is writing this so that we understand how it applies to our life a little bit easier. We also need to understand that he isn't just talking about miracles, he's talking about signs. Signs of who God is and also what it means to be a follower of God. So I want to encourage you to look at John, look at this series through that lens, if you will. And understand that that's what we're looking at. Anybody, I've talked a lot about siblings in the last month or two, and a lot of the stories of myself growing up with my siblings, and usually pastors use their children as illustrations. I don't have any children yet, so I talk about my siblings a lot, right? And the truth is that when you're raised in a family with multiple children, you tend to kind of argue with each other a little bit, not in a mean way, but just a little bit. And when you're young, whether it's with your siblings or with friends, you always, if you do something wrong, you want to point the blame to someone else, right? We want to point the blame to someone else. We aren't guilty, right? It's somebody else's fault as to why we're guilty. You know, Elise and I, like any married couple, sometimes have little discussions. We'll call it that, little discussions. And 99% of the time, I am incorrect, I promise you. I don't know how it's even possible, right? She's like, why are you even going there right now? 99% of the time I am wrong, and the 1% of the time that she might, not be as right as I am. Does anybody have lunch plans today? Because I'm not going to lunch with my wife, I don't think. Whew, oh, Lord. Okay. God, why did you let me do this today? Should have had a guest speaker, I guess. It's so funny that if and it could be something simple, like let's say she forgot to put gas in the car or something like that, or let's say misplaced keys or something like that. Immediately she'll start giggling and laughing as soon as she knows that maybe she didn't do things exactly perfectly the way that I thought that maybe it should have been done, right? And it's so funny. It's so funny because if I'm in trouble, right, it's immediately like, Cam, why would you do that? But if I'm like, Elise, why did you do that? She just starts laughing. I'm like, it's hard to be mad at you when you're laughing, right? Oh, man, I love it. Okay, church, I'm just going to stop talking about this, okay? Anybody ever been blamed for something they didn't do? Yeah? Like I said, I grew up in a household of 4 kids, and so we would get blamed for a lot of things. My sister would blame me, I would blame my brothers, that sort of thing. What's funny is my sister is the youngest, and she was the only girl of 4, so 3 older brothers and a younger sister. And as we're talking, as we're hanging out, as we're doing whatever we were doing as siblings, if she did anything to me, she could totally get away with it. But the moment that I went to do something back to her, retaliation, she would start screaming like a blood-curdling scream. And of course, I would always be the one that got in trouble because I wasn't going to scream like a little girl, but my sister, who was a little girl, she would. We tend to blame others when we get in trouble for something, all right? Maybe you don't anymore as an adult, but definitely when we're younger, we want to blame others. You can see it happen in the workplace. I've seen it happen with coworkers in the past who maybe didn't do things the best that they could have done them. And so instead of just facing up to it and saying, you know what, I should have done X, Y, and Z better, we come up with reasons as to why we didn't do things better. Right? We maybe blame someone else. Well, so-and-so would have gotten me such and such, earlier, then I could have done a better job at this and that, and so on and so forth. I don't know about you, but I like to think of guilt as something that we want to shove off of ourselves, right? Guilt is not a good feeling. It's a heavy feeling. And I think it's something that every creature on planet Earth understands. Dennis, can you play this video, please?
Who did this mess? Who did this? Cody, did you make this mess? Murphy, did you make this mess? Maggie, did you make this mess? Somebody made it. Who made it? Who made this mess? Bad doggies.
That's a pretty good one. And I found this on YouTube, and I was only going to play one of these, but it was the second video was just too good not to play. So Dennis, play the second one too.
Okay, everybody. So Harley and Laura are both currently in trouble, although I believe that only one of them did the dirty little deed. So, Harley and Laura, I need one of you to tell me what the other one did. I need you to rat the other one out. Now, Laura, I know you love your brother, and it would hurt you to turn him in. And Harley, I know you love your sister, and you don't want to get her in trouble. However, whatever one of you turns the other one in, I will be easy on. If you turn your brother or sister in, you will not be punished, okay? So, I know it's going to be hard. I know it's going to be heartbreaking. I know it's going to be one of the most difficult decisions you've ever made in your life to turn your brother or your sister in. I will give you plenty of time to think about it. I'll ask the question. I'll walk away. I'll give you some time to agonize over it, to search your soul, to figure out what the right answer is going to be within your heart. I will give you the opportunity to do the right thing. I know it's going to take some time, but think about it. Think about doing the right thing, guys. So now I ask you, who took the cookie off the counter? Harley. maybe you didn't hear me. Maybe you didn't understand how difficult this question is and how difficult it is to turn in your sister. So I'm going to ask you again, Harley, because I know that this is one of the most difficult things you've ever done. I ask you again, guys. Who stole the cookie off the counter? Loa, do you have anything to say? Speak up for yourself. Loa, was it Harley? Harley, third time is a charm. If it wasn't your sister, we're just going to forget everything that you just said. This is agonizing, Harley. This is difficult. So I'm going to ask you one last time. Who stole the cookie off the counter? Sell out. Take a bow, sell out.
I love it. Anybody have a dog? Anybody have a dog? Boy, when they're guilty, they just can't hide it, can they? They cannot hide it. Our dog, he cracks me up. Oh, my word. You just know. As soon as you walk in the door, if he's torn something up, there's no hiding it. You'd think he would try a little bit better than that. I love this video because it portrays the fact that when we are guilty, or maybe when something bad has gone wrong, we're going to be pretty quick to sell somebody else out, or we're going to be pretty quick to say, hey, it's this person's fault. And the passage that we're looking at today, we're going to focus in John chapter 4 and John chapter 5, kind of jumping around and in between a little bit between these two chapters. And the reason why we're doing that, Jesus has 3 encounters. And in fact, if you look back at John chapter 3, between John 3, 4, and 5, which we're not going to look at John 3 today, but between those 3 chapters, Jesus has encounters with 4 people that he probably should not be having encounters with. Okay? And what I mean by that is this: whether it was political reasons or cultural reasons, or a married woman talking to an unmarried male, being Jesus, all these different reasons, he should not have been having conversations with these people according to cultural norms. All right? And maybe you have some situations like that in your life, some people who maybe you avoid or should avoid for one reason or another, but Jesus is having conversations with people who it was unnatural for him to have conversations with. And not only that, but he kind of catches them in some different things that should not have been going on in their lives. If you look at John chapter 3, Jesus is having a conversation with Nicodemus. You remember Nicodemus is part of the Pharisee group, the group of people who were the religious rulers of the day, the people who were trying to catch Jesus doing things that were incorrect or wrong according to the ancient laws. In John chapter 4, Jesus has a conversation with a Samaritan woman who, and that's what the story we're going to look at today, but Samaritan women and Jewish men, especially married or women who were in relationships, and single men, would not have been okay for them to have a conversation. It wouldn't have been okay for Jesus to have a conversation, a Jewish man to have a conversation with a Samaritan man, because they butted heads. They were like warring people groups. And if you continue in John chapter 4, you see that Jesus had a conversation with in the NIV, it calls him a royal official. In the Greek, the term would be basilikos. And basically what that meant was a servant or a subservient to the king, who at that time would have been Herod, and we know all of the bad things that we've heard about him throughout Scripture. A Roman ruler who would have disagreed with the Jewish people. In fact, later on, we know that the Roman rulers are part of the group that sentenced Jesus to death. If you go on in John chapter 5, you see Jesus having a conversation with a crippled man. Now, crippled men, we might think of somebody who has a disease or is crippled as maybe someone who's just kind of down on their luck. Our culture is very welcoming to people who may have some sort of a disability. But at that time, in their culture, anyone who had that sort of disability, it was thought, now untrue and not correct, but it was thought that they had done something wrong to deserve that disease. So if someone was crippled, it was because they were in some way a sinner. And they were labeled as the unclean. It wouldn't have been okay for Jesus to have had a conversation with a crippled man because Jesus was a rabbi, a religious teacher. And if he had had contact with a crippled man, then he would have been making himself unclean as a result. And we see in John 5 that Jesus has a whole conversation with a crippled man. In fact, Jesus goes out of his way to have that conversation. So in John 3, 4, and 5, Jesus is doing some things that would have been unacceptable in the eyes of the culture. So last week we looked at John chapter 2. We looked at the story, the miracle, the sign of Jesus turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And if you were at our midweek Bible study this last week, we talked about the issue of alcohol and its inclusion in this story here, and how as a denomination, as a church, we are people who choose to abstain from the consumption of alcohol. We do that to have solidarity with our brothers and sisters who have been hurt as a result of alcohol consumption. We looked at that story. We looked at how Jesus performs a sign, a miracle, as we might say, or a sign of his power. We looked at the story of the calling of the disciple Nathanael. And we talked about how Jesus perceived or knew what was going to happen at that wedding before it happened. He knew that the people were going to run out of wine, and so he came in and sort of saved the day. And if you look at that miracle, it'd be easy to just think the story is all about the miracle that Jesus performed. But the truth is it's about the sign, what that miracle was trying to teach people. Okay? And what Jesus was trying to teach people is that he is a God who foresees and knows who you are before you may even realize what is going on. The bride and the groom at the wedding would not have even realized they were running out of beverage for the people who were attending their wedding before. They wouldn't even realize this before Jesus had performed the miracle. So he went ahead and did it. The sign, as I said, is that Jesus knows us. So as we continue to read into John 3, 4, and 5, we see a really interesting thing happen. The book of John is organized into what theologians call cycles. They call cycles. You'll see all throughout John mention of festivities or festivals or events or Sabbath. And what's happening here is all of these early chapters are taking place around the time of Passover. Passover was a very holy time for the Jewish people. It was a time when they would have all gotten together and had a great time partying and doing all their things and remembering that God had delivered them in Egypt. Remember, God had delivered them in Egypt from the hand of the Pharaoh, from the persecution that they had suffered there, and he had done it with what they called Passover. All right? So they're celebrating that. And here in John 4 and John 5, we see that they're in the midst of this cycle of Passover. At the beginning of John 2, it says that Jesus went to Cana in Galilee. At the end of John 4, it says that Jesus returned to Cana of Galilee. And when we look at that whole section there from John 2 to the end of John 4, we know that it is a cycle. It's all to be included in one when we're telling the story of what happened in John 2, 3, and 4. Does that make sense? So all of these stories, everything, the signs that Jesus performs here are meant to be looked at all in one. It'd be like they were in the same chapter in a novel. And that same chapter has everything to do with that central theme. And the central theme is that Jesus knows who people are. He understands who they are before they may even know themselves. That's the theme of John 2, 3, and 4. I want to look specifically at the story of the woman at the well, the royal official, and if we have time, we'll get to the crippled man in John chapter 5. As I was preparing for this message, as I was thinking through what we wanted to preach, or what I wanted to preach exactly this morning, I've been all over the place this week. The Spirit has led me in different places throughout the week, and God has brought different things to my heart and to my mind as to what He wants me to teach you this morning. And yesterday afternoon, when all of the news started to break of what has been occurring just 100 so miles from here in Charlottesville, as all of that news started to break, it was as if God had preordained this message to be brought to you today. Because the truth is that this passage that we're going to look at deals with some very weighty issues of racism in that land at that time. It deals with some very heavy issues of hatred between two different people groups. Now let me say, as I'm preaching today, I am not trying to come down on one side or the other, conservative or liberal or anything like that, okay? What I am trying to say, though, is that God wants us to love people, period. It doesn't matter what we believe politically. It doesn't matter if we voted for this person or that person. What matters is that we need to love people, period, okay? Whether that is someone who looks different than us or whether that is someone who has an extreme view that is different than ours, we need to love people. And we need to defend people who cannot be defended by themselves. We need to love people. We need to defend them. And I'm not talking about physically, okay? I'm talking about their souls. As a church, Church of the Nazarene, we've long been focused on the people in our culture who are kind of cast into the gutter. The unmentionable people of society. We're going to continue to be that way. We're going to look at the person of the woman at the well. Now, we don't even really know her name. So if you would look with me at John chapter 4. If you're wanting to, you can follow along in the Bible app this morning. It's called YouVersion, but it's the most popular one in any of the Google Play Store or the Apple Store for their apps. You can open that. You can search in the events. I believe it's through the menu. You can search for Roanoke First Church of the Nazarene. If you have your location turned on, it should ping directly to our church as you're here. We're going to look at John chapter 4 today, if you follow along with me. There's some important things for us to understand, and we'll get to those. It says this, "Now Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee." Basically what this passage is telling us is that Jesus' name is starting to get out there. People are starting to know who he is. He's gaining a following. It says in verse 4, "Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of the ground of Jacob that had been given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, 'Will you give me a drink?' His disciples had gone into town to buy food." Now the first thing that we need to understand is that there is a rough history between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people. All right? It's a very, very rough history. Some bad things have happened, some terrible things have taken place, and they don't like each other very much. It would have been very similar if you could think back through history of any two people groups split on ethnic lines that would not have enjoyed each other's company. It would have been similar to that, with some violence and hatred mixed in. All right? As I said, the Lord was leading me to preach this message before I even knew what was happening this weekend. So let's keep that in perspective. What happened in the year early on as God had formed the kingdom of Israel? You remember there were 12 tribes of Israel. They were all spread out throughout this area. And what happened is the northern kingdom, which is all 11 tribes, they had split off from Judah. Okay, Judah is the southern kingdom of Israel. And what happened is they all began to follow their own king that had not been chosen by God. That happened in about the 9th century, all right, BCE. They began to follow their own king who had not been preordained by God, and so they split the kingdom in half. Town in Samaria became the capital of the northern kingdom. And what happened in 722 BCE, Samaria, the city fell. All right, it was attacked by Assyria, which was a neighboring kingdom. It was attacked and it fell, and the people, everybody who lived there, were taken out of the city and brought over to Assyria. Very similar to the exile that the southern kingdom, Judah, would experience in just a few hundred years from then. The people were taken to a different country. They were forced to adopt the culture of that country, and then about 100 or so years later, what we know as the Babylonian exile occurred. The same thing happened to Jerusalem and Judah. You see, a neighboring kingdom of Babylon came in and conquered the city, took the people out, made them come live in Babylon, and made them adopt the cultures of Babylon and all of these different things that they might have experienced there. What's interesting is in the year 537, In the year 537, the people of Judah, what we know as the descendants of Christ, were freed to go back to the land that they were from. By the time they had gotten there, Assyria had already let their people go. Does this make sense? Are you tracking with me? Some of you who may not be history people, you may not understand exactly what's going on here. But basically what happened is we have two kingdoms, and one of them separated from the other. They weren't really following the ways of Yahweh or God anymore. And when they separated, another kingdom came in, took them as slaves basically into exile to their kingdom. 100 years later, the other kingdom, same thing. Then around the same time, they both were allowed to go back to their homeland. What happened, and what happens a lot of times when whole people groups are taken over like this, is they're forced to adopt the culture of the country that takes them over, and they're forced to intermingle with those people. What that means is they would take people from the other culture as their spouses. Yahweh had clearly given the people very, very obvious instructions that they were not supposed to intermingle with people from other groups around them. And so what happened is in the year 537, when Jerusalem was handed back over to the Jewish people of the southern kingdom of Judah, what happened is they came back and the Samaritans were already there. They had already returned home. They had already been freed from their exile. And so when they came back, the Samaritans were like, hey, our long-lost brothers and sisters. They were excited. You see, they had been split into the northern kingdom. But when Assyria came over and conquered the northern kingdom, they no longer had those tribes like they used to. Things got all mixed up. And so when they came back to the area around Jerusalem, Samaria, they were excited. They were thinking, hey, we can finally get over all of this past hatred that we had from our two countries splitting. We can get over all of this. We can be one again. What happens is the Jewish people came back in out of their exile, and they realized that the Samaritans had been intermingled with the people of Assyria. And they knew that God had clearly instructed them not to do that, but they couldn't help it. They'd been forced. And so what happens is the Jewish people come in, they come back to the Samaritans. The Samaritans think, oh, everything's going to be great again. We're going to be one people again. The Jewish people don't want anything to do with it. They don't want anything to do with it. If you look in Ezra chapter 4, you'll see a story that kind of chronicles that. There was a man by the name of Sanballat. All right, Sanballat. And he was a religious leader in the Samaritan people. He was what the Jewish people would refer to as a rabbi. And he was forced by the Assyrians to marry an Assyrian woman. He married her, they had a family together, they had children. When the Jewish people realized that this had happened, that he was a religious leader and he had a wife who was from Assyria, they banished him. They ran him out of town. They forced him to leave. There was a lot of hatred, a lot of anger that happened as a result of this. In fact, in the land of Samaria, there's a mountain named Mount Gerizim. There's a mountain named Mount Gerizim, and it's the antithesis, it's the opposite of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. We know that was a very sacred place for Judah, for the Israelites. They were taken to that area. They established their own holy land, essentially, because they weren't allowed to be in Jerusalem with the Jewish people. Now, I know that's a little bit of history, so just walk it back with me. Some of you are thinking, oh, I don't like history. My mind is swimming right now. Basically, all we need to know, the Samaritans, the Jewish people, did not like each other. The Jewish people ran the Samaritans out of town, and they were forced to establish their own holy land as a result. That's basically what happened. So here we have Jesus coming to Samaria. Now, it says in John chapter 4 that Jesus was heading back to Galilee. Galilee is where he started out in John chapter 2. Remember how I said this is a whole cycle. In John 2, he heads to Galilee. And at the end of John 4, he arrives back in Galilee. So here we have, at the beginning of John chapter 4, his journey. Now, it would be interesting. Let's say that right back there where the TV is Galilee. All right, and I'm Jesus. I'm not Jesus, but let's say I'm acting as Jesus. Most Jewish people would hate to go through Samaria. Samaria was in between where they were at and Galilee. It was in between. So Jesus, there's a clear road that he could take that went directly to Galilee. But in order to get there, he had to go through Samaria first. Almost all Jewish people at that time, they would take an alternate route to get there. because they hated Samaria so much they didn't want to even go through it. So instead of walking straight down the easy road to get there, they would go way out here. They'd go all the way to the border so they could walk this way and they could get to Galilee, right over here underneath where the TV is, if we're imagining that. They could get there without going through Samaria on their way. But Jesus decided to go right through Samaria. Remember, John 2, John 3, and John 4 all kind of have a central theme of Jesus knowing us before we even realize that he knows us. Nathanael in John 2, he called him to come be a disciple. He said, I saw you while you were sitting on the side of the road. In John chapter 3, he understands and knows Nicodemus before Nicodemus can even really ask the questions that he wants to ask. And in John chapter 4, Jesus knows this woman is going to be at the well. Why else would he go there? Why else would he go that way? There was a very safe, easy route. But instead, he went right through the heart of the place that he knew he could be attacked and hurt. Last week, we talked a little bit about places in our world that we're not supposed to go. You know, neighborhoods that when you're driving through there, later you tell somebody, oh, I drove to that neighborhood. They're like, why'd you go down there? That's a dangerous place to be. It's the other side of the tracks. And that's sort of where Jesus was. He was at the well. He came there. It was the middle of the day. So it was a very, very, very hot moment. It was, remember, we're talking about like arid climate here, desert. And it's the middle of the day as Jesus is approaching the well. And he comes up, and there's a Samaritan woman who is there as well. Now, it's very uncommon for her to be there at the well at that moment. Why would she be there in the middle of the heat of the day? It's been really, really hot here over the last month, right? I mean, it's a little bit better this week, but 3 weeks ago or so, it was just terrible, terrible hot. And, Elise and I kept thinking, on Saturday, we got to get the dog out for a walk. We'd be lazy in the morning, make some breakfast, right? And then by the time 1 o'clock rolled around or so, we'd be like, all right, we got to get the dog out for a walk. So we'd think, all right, let's go down to the Greenway and take a nice walk. But by the time we got down there at like 2 in the afternoon, it was so stinking hot, the dog would walk like 10 feet, and as soon as he saw a shadow from the tree, he would make a beeline to the shadow and just flop onto his back. Right? He didn't want to be out in the heat of the day. We would walk over the bridges that go across the river, and I'm telling you, we'd almost have to hold him by his leash up because he wanted to jump in the water so bad. It was hot. You don't go out in the middle of the heat of the day. Not only that, but let's understand culture context here. As we talked about last week, you and I can go and turn on the tap and we have fresh water coming out, right? But in an arid climate, where they didn't have any plumbing like you and I have, the well would have been a very important place. Every morning, all of the women from the nearby town that's listed here as Sychar, they would have all gone to the well at the same time. It's kind of like the watering hole or the water cooler at work. Anybody have a water cooler or maybe a break room where everybody kind of gathers, for a few minutes break, they grab a drink of coffee or whatever. We have that water cooler talk. It's this thing in our culture where people would gather around the water. It's kind of the same way, except for instead of being in a nice air-conditioned office, it's like 100 degrees all the time and no shade, okay? So the well was an important place. The women would have all gone there together, and yet we have this woman who is alone in the middle of the heat of the day getting water. Why? Why is she doing that? Nobody else would do that. It was a bad idea. It was a bad place to be. In verse 7 it says, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? His disciples were not with him. They had gone into town to buy food. The reason why the author includes this here is because the disciples would have been shocked that Jesus was talking to this woman. So the author says the disciples weren't there to help us understand why Jesus would even be brave enough to talk to her. In verse 9, the Samaritan woman said to him, you are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews did not associate with Samaritans. Let's keep in mind that they didn't associate with Samaritans. They especially did not associate with Samaritan women. All right? And this woman, we'll find out in just a few verses, has a very checkered past. She's had multiple husbands, And the man that she is living with now, this is the words of Jesus, she's not even married to him. This woman, if you look at the Mishnah, which is the set of Jewish laws that determine the way that they should live, if you look at the Mishnah, she would have been considered the lowest class possible. In fact, when I looked at the Mishnah this week as I was studying this, it said that she would have been considered in a perpetual state of impurity. Ooh, that's kind of a mean insult. Can you imagine a perpetual state of impurity? There is nothing that she could do to make herself clean. We're not talking about filthy, taking a shower or something like that. We're talking about the things that she has engaged in life, the people that she's been with, multiple husbands, a sexual partner at that moment that she wasn't even married to, someone she was living with, and the fact that she was a Samaritan would have meant that she was deplorable, disgusting, unmentionable, and a perpetual state of impurity. Ooh, that's tough, right? And Jesus is talking to her, all right? It'd be like if you saw me walking down the street talking to a prostitute. You'd say, why is our pastor talking to that woman? Ooh, right? Why is he doing that? That's what's happening here, okay? It's a bad thing. It'd be like if you saw my car parked at a strip club, all right? That wouldn't be a good thing. That would be a bad thing, right? I probably wouldn't be your pastor for very long after that. Okay? That's similar to what's happening here. It's a bad thing. It looks bad on Jesus. And it says the disciples weren't there because if they had been there, he would have been in big trouble. Jesus answered her. In verse 9, I apologize. The Samaritan woman said, "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" There's a few interesting things that happen here in these verses. The first is that the woman says, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with." She is saying this as she is holding a bucket in her hand, okay? With a rope on it probably. She is saying, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with." Well, it's kind of like if you asked somebody for a drink of water and they were carrying a whole case of water bottles and they said, "You don't have anything to drink." You'd be like, "Wait, what? No, you're holding water in your hands right now." That's what's happening here. But this is another taboo between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. They were forbidden to use the same vessels to eat or drink off of. It'd be similar to, in our country's past, separate water fountains. Okay? That's what's happening here. They were forbidden to consume food or water from the same vessels because Samaritan people made it unclean. That's what they believed, that Samaritan people made it unclean. So she says, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with." The other thing that she says is, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself?" This is a Samaritan woman saying our father Jacob, the same Jacob that the Jewish people would claim as their heritage. Remember, the Samaritan people are the Jewish people. They just got mixed in with all these Assyrian people. All right? They were all one, and then they got mixed up. A couple of exiles, a couple of countries breaking away from each other. And so here the Samaritan woman is saying, "This is our well. We claim it as our heritage." And Jesus, or we read earlier on in John 4 that the Jewish people claim it as their heritage as well. So she's saying, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself?" What she's saying is, you're saying you have better water than what's here? She was missing the point. Jesus is saying to her, if you knew who was asking you for a drink, if you knew that it was the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. She misses the point. What Jesus is trying to say is, I'm the Messiah, I'm here, okay? I have living water for you, water that will allow you to never have thirst again. If you knew that, if you understood that, you would be asking me for a drink instead of me asking you for a drink. The woman then goes on to say, well, what are you going to draw the water with? And are you saying the water from our well is not very good? This is the water of our ancestors. Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Again, Jesus is trying to help her understand that it's not about the water that's in the well. It's about what he has to offer her. Again, John 2, 3, and 4 are all about this central theme of God, Jesus, understanding us before we even really understand ourselves, what we need. So Jesus is saying, look, the water you think you need is not the real water you think you need. The things that you seek in life, something to quench your thirst, is not going to ever quench your thirst, because what you really need is a relationship with God. I mean, can we just apply that directly to our lives, church? That whatever we may seek to feel fulfilled in life, whatever we may seek to make ourselves feel good, whether it's a job, money, family, a good house, a good car, these things are all fine. There's nothing wrong with them. We need them, right? We need those things. But none of them will ever fill us up the way that a relationship with God will. And that's what Jesus is saying here. If you understood what I have to offer you, you wouldn't want all this other stuff. You would want what I have to offer. The woman, in response to this, says, Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming up here to draw water. Again, she's missing the point. She's saying, if you've got this great water, why don't you just give it to me, brother? All right? Why don't you just give it to me? If you've got something this great, be like if you said, hey, I've got this awesome meal back home. It's cooking right now. It's all ready to go. It's piping hot. And you know what? If you eat it, you'll never be hungry again. But you don't offer it to the person. She's saying, give it to me. Give it to me. I'll take it. Give it to me. And he says to her, interesting response, go call your husband and then come back. She replies, I have no husband. Jesus said, you're right when you say that you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands, and the man you have now is not even your husband. What you've just said is quite true. Sir, the woman said, I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth. The woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. I am he. There's a number of interesting things happening here. You see, Jesus explains to the woman that he has this living water, that if she drinks it, she will never be thirsty again. He explains to her that he has something better to offer to her. He explains exactly what it is. He explains that he is the Messiah. He explains that the water you're drinking, the way that you're living your life, all of these things, I have something that is better than this for you. And her response is, well, you know what, there's a Messiah that's coming, and he's going to explain all of this to us. She says, I can see that you are a prophet. And the reason why she says that is pretty clear. Jesus tells her exactly what's going on in her life. All right? Before she even says anything, Jesus tells her exactly what's going on in her life. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're living with now is not even your husband. Jesus knew her before she even knew what she needed herself. He says to her, I have this living water, this thing that if you drink it, you will never thirst again. You see here on the screen, it says this in John chapter 4, a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. You see, what Jesus is trying to say to her is really, really interesting and a very, very deep thing. You see, in John chapter 4, Jesus has this little soliloquy, this little speech where he's kind of sharing some deep knowledge with her, and he's saying to her in response, in verse 19, the woman says, I can see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. You see, when the Samaritan people and the Jewish people split up, when the Jewish people forced the Samaritans out of Jerusalem, what they did is they went to this other place and they established a holy place for them, essentially their own holy land, and that was a place called Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim is really interesting because they built a temple to God, to Yahweh, on Mount Gerizim, and they worshipped Yahweh there because they were not allowed to worship Yahweh at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They were forced to worship him at a different location. They were forced to go out of the city, to go to their own land and worship him there. And what she says, when Jesus calls her out on all of her stuff, all the ugliness of her life, when he says, you've had 5 husbands in the past, and the man you're sleeping with now, he's not even your husband, her response is, "Sir, I can see you are a prophet. I can understand that you know things about me that nobody else knows. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that that place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." What she is saying is not this simple thing. Sometimes when we read this, we read, "Sir, I can see that you're a prophet, but you claim da-da-da," and it's easy for us to miss the message behind these verses. What she is saying is, you don't have any right to say to me anything about myself. That's her response here. Jesus says, "Look, you have had these 5 husbands, da-da-da-da." She says, "Sir, you," meaning the Jewish people, "forced us out of our homeland and made us worship God at this other mountain. And now you're telling me that I need to come to Jerusalem to worship? You are the ones who did this to us." You know, when we're caught in something that we know we shouldn't have done or we know we shouldn't have been doing, it's easy for us to point the fingers and pass the blame. And it's 100% natural and understandable that when this woman was confronted with her sin, instead of owning it, she said, "Sir, you have no right." Because she didn't understand who he was. She didn't know that he was the Messiah. She didn't get all this. She says, "You forced us to worship at this other mountain. And then you say the only place where you can truly worship God is in Jerusalem." And Jesus responds, "Believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews." What Jesus is saying here is this, that there is a history of what God has done, and we should look to that as a sign of what God is going to do. In the English, when we read this verse, it sounds like what Jesus is saying is salvation is from the Jews, so you don't have any access to it. What he's really saying is God has provided in the past and he will provide in the future. A time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. What Jesus is saying is this: it doesn't matter if you are a Jew, it doesn't matter if you are a Samaritan, it doesn't matter if you worship at this place or that place. What matters is that you worship God in spirit and in truth. There is a time coming when the true worshipers will be revealed, and it doesn't matter who you are at that time. What matters is that you are a follower of God. Okay? So church, let me be very, very, very clear in what I'm saying right now. It doesn't matter who we think we are. It doesn't matter that we're a Nazarene or a Baptist or a Catholic. For some reason, in the Nazarene church, we have this chip on our shoulder against Catholics. I've never understood it because we come from Catholicism, okay? Way back when. The truth is that we have all of these things that we divide ourselves on. In our culture, we divide ourselves, white, black, Latino, Asian, whatever. We divide ourselves on the languages that we speak. We divide ourselves on all of these different things, on poor or middle class or rich. We divide ourselves on Republican or Democrat. And the truth is that there is a time coming when the true worshipers will be revealed. And the true worshipers are the people who worship God in spirit and in truth, and they don't get distracted by all this other stuff. All of these things that have come from the past that is an ugly past. They don't get distracted by that stuff. They don't worry about that stuff. All they're focused on is the reality that our God is bigger and greater than all of it. Amen. that nothing can stand up against Jesus Christ, who knew you before you even knew yourself. You see, Jesus saw this woman, he named the sins that were in her past, and he said to her, I have something for you that is much greater than all of this. The water that you seek, you just want to quench your thirst for a moment, but what I have to offer you will quench your thirst forever. What he's saying to her is not about the Samaritan woman. What he's saying to her is all about all of the Samaritan people and the rift that has developed between them and the Jewish people. He's saying, look, there is nothing that is greater than the fact that you can worship God. And there is a time coming when it won't matter if you worship on this mountain or this church or that church, or if you're a liberal or if you're right wing or if you're this or if you're that or if you're da-da-da-da-da-da-da. What matters is if you worship God in spirit and in truth. And let me tell you, church, that people can worship God in spirit and in truth, and it will God will reveal through that person in their actions. So, when we see things that happen like what happened this weekend, and our response is to light up a torch and go march for one side or the other, when we see something posted on Facebook and we get on there and start an argument or something on there, boy, I tell you what, last year during the election cycle, I just got off of Facebook. Because I was seeing good Christian people go in there and call people names. You think that Samaritan woman felt bad when she was labeled as perpetually impure? It's not our job to label people. What is our job is to reveal God in spirit and in truth. And in power. And he can conquer anything. John 4 continues, and what happens next is really, really amazing. She says, I know that a Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything to us. And Jesus declared, I am he. What happens next is the disciples come back, and they get on Jesus for talking to a Samaritan woman, because he shouldn't have been doing that, right? They get on him for that. And then she goes back home and tells everybody about what happened. She goes back home and shares the news. And it says this, in John 4, they said to the woman, remember the people who knew all of her past, all of the ugly things about her, all of the sins that she had committed, they said to her, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. Here we have a bunch of people who have come to know God because of the story of redemption that has taken place in this woman's life. So what is our role as Christians then in response? One is to steer away from divisiveness and hatred in our culture. Like we talked about just 120 some miles away from here, this last weekend, some bad things happened. And I know that our media can blow things out of proportion. I don't know, I wasn't there. But what I do know is that people lost their lives over something bad. Okay? We are supposed to hate that kind of division, but love people through it. Love them in spite of it. I'm sure that Jesus didn't love the fact that this woman had 5 husbands and was with a guy now who she wasn't married to. But he didn't let that distract him. He shared with her the love, the living water. That's our first thing. The second thing is that we can know that Jesus does the same thing for us. If there's something in your life right now that is ugly, that you don't want people to know about, that maybe people would label you as impure if they knew was in your life, guess what? Jesus rises above that. That thing does not have power over your life, and you can renounce it in the name of Jesus Christ. He is your Messiah. He is your Savior. You can have a relationship with him, and you can be cleansed. You see, as Christian people, if you're here today, I assume you at least have some inkling of desiring to go to church. Maybe you're a Christian, maybe you just came today. But the truth is that there are people in this room right now who have the weight of sin on their lives. And I'm willing to bet that if you're at church and you have the weight of sin on your life, that you have something in your life that you've been battling against for a long time. Some sin that keeps coming back, something that you haven't been able to put to bed, something that you haven't been able to put to rest. Just like this woman, she had something in her life that she wasn't able to get over. And what Jesus said to her is, look, you keep drinking this regular water, and I have a living water. So the same thing is true for you. If you are here and there is something in your life that has you in bondage, that has you in chains to sin, know this, that Jesus Christ came to break those chains. He has living water for you that can quench your thirst forever. The third thing is this: go and tell people about it. Go and tell people about it. The chapter of John ends with a story of Jesus having an encounter with a royal official. It says this: after 2 days he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet was no honor in his country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. As he's coming into Galilee, he visited Cana, where he had turned the water into wine. There was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Jesus said, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. The royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. Go, Jesus replied, your son will live. The rest of the story goes like this. The man went home. On his way home, his servants met him halfway and said, your son is healed. He said, my son is healed. When did it happen? About 1 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday. He said, that's the exact time I was talking to Jesus. My son is healed, hallelujah. And his whole house came to know the Lord, came to follow God. The reason why I share this story to wrap things up is because Jesus knew this man was a follower of him. He knew that he believed in him. He knew that he had faith in him. And that's why he healed his son. Because the man believed. The man was a Roman royal official. You remember who put Jesus to death just a little bit after this? Roman royal officials, right? Yet this man believed. And his son was healed because of it. And this is how I want to end today. And the worship team, you can come up. No matter what it is in life, whether it's a sin that you are wrestling with, whether it is something that you have not been able to get over or get past, maybe it's brokenness in our culture like what happened to our neighbors this weekend. Maybe it's brokenness politically in general. Maybe we look at our world, at our lives, the things that we face, our personal sin, the things that are ugly in our world, and we think, how is God even real? Because this is an ugly situation. This man and this woman who had every reason to be opposite of Jesus. This is the miracle that Jesus is performing. We see it, the miracle at the very end here that we might get distracted by is, oh, Jesus healed this boy from his sickness. That's great. But it's a sign of what Jesus is going to do and has done. That there is nothing that is too big or too great for God to conquer. Whether it's racism in our world, or whether it's sin in your life, whether it's a health issue or whatever it may be, here's the reality, church. That Jesus Christ has a living water for us, a living water that will heal, can heal, and if we believe in it, if we have faith in it, and faith in him, he will reveal through us that miracle. So what are you saying today, Pastor Cam? Are you saying that if I have a sickness that God's going to heal me if I just believe in him? Yeah. But what I'm really saying is let's not look at the miracle. Let's look at the sign. The sign is this, that he wants to have a relationship with you that is based in spirit and in truth, where you are a true worshiper of him. Because a time is coming when the true worshipers will be revealed. And I don't know about you, but I want to be in that camp, don't you? I want to be a part of that team. I want to be there. So if there's something in your life, maybe it's something in your family that's happened that's awful, maybe it's something that's a health situation, whatever it may be, know this, that God is bigger than that thing. And you can have faith and believe that he can conquer it. Would you worship with us?
There is a river and there is a fountain that frees the soul from sin. Won't you come to this water? There